It started with a post-it note. A small yellow square, perched innocently on my desk at the university, with "lunch later." Samantha Red Heart, scrawled in her familiar looping handwriting. At first, I smiled, tucking it into the drawer with the others she'd left over the past few weeks. Samantha, my wife of 9 years, had developed a habit of popping by my office unannounced lately. She claimed she missed me. It was flattering at first. She'd breeze in with her radiant smile, carrying a coffee or a snack she thought I might like. "I just wanted to surprise you," she'd say, leaning against the doorframe like it was the most natural thing in the world. And in those moments, I felt like the luckiest man alive. But the frequency started to bother me. Samantha was a homebody, or at least she always had been. She was the type to spend her mornings tending to the garden, her afternoons baking, and her evenings curled up on the couch with a novel. The Samantha I knew never enjoyed bustling around the campus, mingling with faculty and students. Yet now, here she was, every few days, smiling brightly as if she belonged. And then there was Ethan Carter. Ethan was one of my brightest students. A senior majoring in political science, he was sharp, ambitious, and eager to impress. He was the kind of student professors kept an eye on, sure he'd be running for office someday. But something about Ethan had started to irritate me lately. He was always hanging around after class, asking questions that felt more like opportunities to brag. And now, he seemed to be everywhere Samantha was. The first time I noticed it was during one of her surprise visits. Samantha arrived just as I was wrapping up a lecture, her flowing sundress catching the sunlight streaming through the lecture hall's windows. She waved at me, her smile lighting up the room. Ethan saw her first. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, stepping forward before I could even respond. "Nice to see you again." "Ethan." Samantha's voice was bright and warm, like they were old friends. She tilted her head, laughing as he joked about being stuck in one of my long-winded lectures. I watched as her hand brushed his arm lightly, a fleeting touch that sent an uncomfortable jolt through my chest. That night, I brought it up. We were sitting at the dinner table, the clinking of forks against plates filling the silence. "You've been coming by campus a lot," I said carefully, trying to keep my tone neutral. Samantha barely looked up. "So? I like spending time with you." "And Ethan?" I asked, watching her reaction closely. She finally looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What about him?" "You seem close," I said, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. She let out a laugh, light and dismissive. "Matt, don't be ridiculous. He's a kid." But her laughter didn't soothe me. It grated. I let it drop, not wanting to push her into an argument. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Samantha slept soundly beside me, doubt crept in. Her touch on his arm, the way she laughed a little too hard at his jokes, the extra care she seemed to take with her appearance on the days she visited, it all nagged at me, 1,000 tiny splinters burrowing under my skin. By the next morning, I had convinced myself I was imagining things. Samantha was loyal, I told myself. Loving. She had stood by me through the highs and lows of my career, through the miscarriages and the failed IVF attempts that left her emotionally gutted. But the unease lingered. 2 days later, I found her in my office again. This time, Ethan was with her. I walked in to find them sitting across from each other, Ethan perched on the edge of my desk while Samantha sat in my chair. They were laughing about something private, something I wasn't part of. When they saw me, Samantha jumped up, her smile faltering for just a second before she smoothed it back into place. "Matt. You're back early," she said, her voice overly cheerful. Ethan stood as well, offering a sheepish grin. "Sorry, Dr. Callahan. I was just asking your wife about her thoughts on the campaign project." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Samantha busied herself collecting her things, her movements too quick, too eager to leave. As they exited, Ethan turned to her with a grin I didn't like. "See you later, Samantha." Later. That word echoed in my mind long after they were gone. Later. I didn't know it yet, but that single word was the beginning of the unraveling. It was a Thursday afternoon when my lecture was cancelled. I should have stayed at the university, caught up on grading, or prepared for next week's seminar. But the thought of surprising Samantha tugged at me, a small way to make up for the tension that had simmered between us lately. I stopped by a local cafe to pick up her favorite caramel macchiato before heading home. Her car was already in the driveway when I pulled in. Odd, I thought. She'd mentioned running errands all afternoon, but maybe she'd finished early. As I approached the front door, the faint sound of music filtered through, soft, melodic, and achingly familiar. It was our song, the jazz standard we danced to at our wedding. My hand paused on the doorknob, a strange mixture of nostalgia and unease settling in my chest. Why was she playing that song? I turned the handle and stepped inside. The scent of her lavender candles mingled with something else, something unfamiliar, a faint whiff of cologne I didn't recognize. "Samantha." I called out, walking down the hallway. The living room came into view, and the world seemed to tilt off its axis. There they were, entwined on the couch like two puzzle pieces that shouldn't fit. Samantha was draped over Ethan, her face buried in his neck. His hand rested possessively on her hip, fingers curling slightly as if to claim her. The blanket I'd bought on a whim during our last vacation was tossed over their laps, its edges brushing the floor. The coffee cup slipped from my hand, hitting the hardwood with a dull thud and spilling its contents. Samantha's head jerked up at the sound. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Matt," she started, her voice strangled. She scrambled to pull the blanket around herself, the picture of panicked guilt. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't bother hiding anything. He leaned back casually, smirking like he'd just scored the winning goal in a game only he knew he was playing. "What the hell is this?" My voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and rising anger. "It's not what it looks like." Samantha stammered, clutching the blanket like it could shield her from the truth unraveling around her. "It's exactly what it looks like," Ethan cut in smoothly, rising to his feet. His smirk deepened as he looked me square in the eye, utterly unapologetic. "She's leaving you, man. You should have seen this coming." My gaze snapped to Samantha, searching her face for some kind of denial, some hint that this was all a mistake. But she couldn't meet my eyes. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her hands trembling. "I was going to tell you," she said weakly. "You were going to tell me?" I repeated, my voice rising. The weight of her betrayal hit me like a truck, knocking the air from my lungs. "You've been sneaking around with a student. How long, Samantha? How long has this been going on?" She flinched at the accusation, her lips trembling as she fumbled for words. "Matt, please, it's complicated." "Complicated?" My laugh came out bitter and hollow. "You're my wife. This is our home. What's complicated about that?" Ethan snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Maybe if you weren't so busy playing professor, you'd have noticed her needs weren't being met." His words sliced through me like a blade. My fists clenched, every muscle in my body screaming for action. But instead of lunging at him, I forced myself to take a step back. I couldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Samantha reached out, her voice trembling. "Matt, please. Don't." But I was already moving, turning on my heel and heading for the door. Behind me, I heard Ethan's cocky voice, dripping with mock sympathy. "Guess you'll have to find somewhere else to crash tonight, old man." I slammed the door so hard the frame rattled. The cold air outside hit me like a slap, clearing the haze of shock and fury clouding my thoughts. My car sat in the driveway, but I couldn't bring myself to get in. I stood there instead, staring at the house, our house, feeling like an intruder in my own life. The coffee stain on the floor. The blanket on the couch. The song that still played faintly through the walls. Everything about that moment was burned into my memory, a brand searing itself onto my soul. I had trusted her. I had loved her. I had sacrificed for her. And this was how she repaid me. I climbed into my car and drove aimlessly, the betrayal replaying over and over in my mind. Samantha's lies. Ethan's smirk. The look in her eyes when I asked her how long it had been. My chest felt hollow, the weight of my broken trust sitting heavy where my heart used to be. But even as the pain threatened to consume me, a new emotion began to take root, slowly, steadily, like a spark catching on dry kindling. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't despair. It was anger. I wasn't going to let them win. Samantha didn't even try to hide it anymore. The day after I caught her with Ethan, she acted as though I was the one who had crossed a line. When I came home that evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table, wine glass in hand, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. "You stormed out," she said without looking up. "That was childish, Matt." I stared at her, my hand still on the keys in the door. "I caught you with another man in our house, Samantha. What exactly was I supposed to do? Bring you both coffee?" She rolled her eyes, finally setting the glass down. "You're overreacting. You always overreact. It's suffocating." "Suffocating?" I repeated, the word tasting sour on my tongue. "You think I'm the problem?" "Yes," she snapped, standing and crossing her arms. "You're so controlling, Matt. Always working, always lecturing, always trying to manage everything. I needed someone who actually listens to me." "And that's Ethan?" I asked, incredulous. "A 22-year-old kid? A student? That's who understands you?" Her eyes narrowed, lips curling into something between a sneer and a smirk. "He's more of a man than you'll ever be." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I swallowed the rising anger, forcing myself to stay calm. Losing my temper would only give her more ammunition. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs, shutting the door to our bedroom. It didn't take long for things to spiral after that. Samantha refused to leave the house, claiming she had just as much right to be here as I did. And she didn't just stay, she flaunted her relationship with Ethan like a badge of honor. He started coming over almost every day. I'd walk into the living room to find them curled up on the couch, whispering and laughing like teenagers. Sometimes I'd hear their voices upstairs, echoing through the walls I'd painted with her just a year ago. They weren't discreet, and they didn't care. I could have kicked her out. Called the cops. Filed for divorce immediately. But instead, I bided my time. I wasn't going to confront her without proof so undeniable that even she couldn't twist it into her own warped version of events. The first piece of evidence came by accident. One evening, while Samantha was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Ethan popped up, the preview impossible to miss. "You were incredible last night. Same time tomorrow." My stomach churned, but I didn't look away. Instead, I picked up the phone and snapped a picture of the screen. When I scrolled up through the messages, I found a goldmine of incriminating texts, plans for meetups, declarations of love, inside jokes that made my skin crawl. I took screenshots of everything. Next came the receipts. Samantha had always been careless with her spending, leaving crumpled receipts stuffed in her purse or lying around the house. I started collecting them: hotel rooms, fancy dinners, lingerie. Some of the dates lined up with nights she'd claimed to be visiting her sister or running errands. Ethan wasn't exactly subtle either. I found one of his notebooks left on the coffee table, its pages filled with scribbled ideas for papers and personal musings. One entry caught my eye. "Samantha says she'll leave Matt soon. She just needs to figure out the money situation." Wish she'd hurry up already. Can't wait to make her mine completely. I took photos of that too. Bit by bit, I built my case. Emails she'd sent him from our shared laptop, calendar appointments labeled E-Red Heart, photos she carelessly uploaded to a cloud account we still shared, all of it went into a folder I labeled evidence. It was methodical. Clinical. A part of me felt detached as I worked, like I was documenting someone else's life falling apart. But every time I looked at the growing stack of proof, the rage simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. Still, I stayed quiet. Samantha, emboldened by my apparent passivity, grew even bolder. She started hosting Ethan openly, treating our house like a motel. I'd come home to find them cooking in the kitchen, his hands brushing hers as she giggled over some inside joke. "You're late," she'd say, barely glancing up from the stove. I didn't respond, heading upstairs to the guest room where I'd been sleeping since that night. It wasn't worth the fight. And then came the breaking point. I found a receipt for a weekend getaway, a cabin in the mountains. The date was next weekend, and the reservation was under her name. When I confronted her, holding the receipt between two fingers like it was toxic, she didn't even blink. "I needed a break," she said flatly. "With him?" I demanded. She shrugged, her eyes cold. "I deserve to be happy, Matt. You wouldn't understand." I stared at her, words failing me for the first time since this nightmare began. The audacity, the sheer gall of it all, it was almost laughable. That night, as I sat in the guest room surrounded by folders, screenshots, and receipts, I knew the time had come. I had everything I needed. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment of humiliation, it was all there in black and white, a damning portrait of Samantha's deceit. I looked at the stack of evidence one last time, then slid it into a manila envelope. The humiliation I'd endured wasn't for nothing. It was time to show Samantha and Ethan exactly who they were dealing with. 2 weeks passed in tense silence. I stayed quiet, biding my time, while Samantha and Ethan paraded their relationship like a twisted trophy. She stopped pretending to hide her visits to campus, and he didn't bother with basic decency. It was humiliating, but I swallowed the anger, knowing my moment would come. It came sooner than I expected. I was halfway through a lecture on political theory when the door to my classroom creaked open. Every head turned to see Samantha standing in the doorway, her arm looped around Ethan's like they were walking the red carpet. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, smiling sweetly as if this were some casual visit. Ethan followed her in, wearing a smirk that sent a ripple of murmurs through the room. I paused mid-sentence, the chalk hovering in my hand. "Have a seat," I said evenly, gesturing toward the back of the room. To my irritation, they didn't take the hint. Instead, they stood there, soaking in the attention. Samantha whispered something to Ethan, her laughter carrying through the room like nails on a chalkboard. My students stared, caught between confusion and second-hand embarrassment. I turned back to the board and finished my lecture, my voice steady despite the fire building in my chest. When the class ended, I dismissed the students, keeping my eyes fixed on Ethan. "Mr. Carter, a word?" He exchanged a glance with Samantha, who gave him a smug little nod. He swaggered to my desk, his hands jammed in his pockets, while she lingered by the door, watching with barely concealed amusement. I waited until the room was empty before shutting the door. I walked to my desk and sat down, leveling him with a cold stare. "I know you're sleeping with my wife," I said, my tone matter-of-fact. Ethan didn't flinch. He leaned back in the chair across from me, lacing his fingers behind his head. "So? What are you going to do about it? Fail me?" I smiled faintly, sliding a printed essay across the desk. "No. But I will send this to the dean." His smirk faltered as he picked up the paper. It took him a moment to realize what it was, a word-for-word copy of an article from a prominent academic journal. His essay. "This is your work, isn't it?" I asked, folding my hands. He swallowed hard, his cocky demeanor cracking. You can't prove I plagiarized that. I can, I said, leaning forward. I have the original article, timestamps, and even metadata proving you downloaded it before submitting your paper. You'll lose your scholarship, your credits, everything you've worked for. And I won't stop there. I'll make sure every graduate school in the country knows what you've done. His face drained of color, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. You wouldn't. Oh, I would, I said, my voice icy. You had the audacity to disrespect me in my own home, to flaunt your affair in front of my students, to treat this like a game. You think I'm bluffing? Test me. He glared at me, his hands shaking as he shoved the essay back across the desk. You're pathetic, he muttered, standing abruptly. Pathetic? I echoed, rising to meet his gaze. You're the one about to lose everything because you couldn't keep your ego in check. Now get out of my office. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Samantha, who had been waiting in the hallway, rushed after him, calling his name. I stayed behind, the tension in my shoulders slowly easing as I sat back in my chair. The fallout was swift. Within days, Ethan was called into an academic integrity hearing. The evidence was undeniable, and he was expelled for plagiarism. Word spread quickly, and his name became a cautionary tale around campus. His future, once so promising, was in shambles. Samantha, predictably, was furious. You ruined his life, she screamed when I got home that evening, her face red with anger. How could you be so cruel? You brought him into our house, I shot back, my voice calm but firm. You flaunted your betrayal like it was nothing. Don't talk to me about cruelty, Samantha. He doesn't deserve this, she spat. And neither did I said, my tone cutting. But unlike you, he'll have to deal with the consequences of his actions. For the first time, she didn't have a response. She just stood there, seething, before grabbing her purse and storming out. The next day, she packed her things and left. I didn't ask where she was going, and I didn't care. I watched her drive away without a hint of regret. The house, once filled with memories of love and partnership, felt lighter without her. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But that wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Samantha thought she could leave with the upper hand, but she'd forgotten one simple truth: the house, the savings, even the car she used to shuttle Ethan around, it was all mine. Legally, she had no claim. The day she walked out with her suitcase was the day I filed for divorce. When the papers were served, her reaction was as predictable as the seasons. This is ridiculous, she hissed during our first court hearing. She wore a sharp blazer, her hair perfectly styled, trying to look like the composed victim. I deserve half. I gave him everything. Her lawyer leaned into the same tired narrative, painting me as an absentee husband who valued his work over his wife. They tried to frame my actions against Ethan as vindictive and abusive, claiming I used my position of power to ruin his life. But I wasn't walking into this unprepared. My lawyer presented the mountain of evidence I'd gathered, her texts, her financial records, and her blatant infidelity. Then came the piece de resistance, the receipts showing how Samantha had drained thousands from our joint account to fund her escapades with Ethan. She abandoned her marital obligations, my lawyer said calmly, flipping through the pages of damning documentation. This isn't a divorce caused by irreconcilable differences. This is the result of betrayal and deceit. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. The house? Mine. The savings? Mine. The car? Mine. Samantha walked out of that courtroom with nothing but her lies and the realization that she'd underestimated me. Her spiral was quick and public. Through the university grapevine, I learned that Ethan's life had fallen apart as well. Expelled for plagiarism, his academic reputation was in tatters. His professors, once eager to mentor him, now avoided even speaking his name. His friends dropped him, distancing themselves from the scandal. Even his family, humiliated by his actions, cut ties. He tried reaching out to Samantha, desperately, from what I heard. But without my resources to lean on, she became just another complication in his sinking life. And Samantha? She drifted between friends' couches, trying to spin her sob story. I overheard snippets in town, how she claimed I was cold, neglectful, and controlling. Her theatrics bought her sympathy from a few people, but even they grew tired of her shifting blame. She showed up at the house once, months after the divorce was finalized. I was in the middle of repainting the living room, trying to erase the last traces of her betrayal. The knock on the door caught me off guard. When I opened it, there she stood, looking worn and desperate. "Matt," she said softly, her voice almost unrecognizable. I leaned against the doorframe, waiting for her to speak. I made a mistake," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "I was selfish, and I hurt you. I hurt us. Is there any chance we can talk? Maybe work things out?" For a brief moment, I just stared at her, stunned by the sheer audacity of her request. Then, I shook my head. "No, Samantha," I said, my voice steady and firm. "There's nothing left to work out." Her face crumpled, and she turned to leave. I shut the door behind her, locking it for good. Now, the house is mine again. It's quiet and peaceful, the way it used to be before the lies crept in. I've started repainting the walls, each stroke of the brush a small act of reclamation. The soft beige in the living room, the calming blue in the bedroom, it feels like a fresh start. I've moved my things back into the master bedroom, rearranging the furniture, throwing out anything that reminded me of her. The garden is mine to tend now, and I've added new flowers, tearing out the wilted remains of what Samantha once planted. Life is rebuilding itself, one day at a time. Sometimes, I think about what she's doing now, but the curiosity is fleeting. Whatever her story is, it's no longer my concern. Ethan, Samantha, the betrayal, they're ghosts now, fading into the past. The house is quiet when I sit in the evenings, sipping a cup of coffee and staring at the freshly painted walls. It's a silence that feels earned, a reminder of everything I fought for and reclaimed. I've learned that betrayal doesn't define you. How you rise from it does. And as I look around at this house, my sanctuary, I know I've won. Not just the battles, but the war.